So with that, I'll throw to August Kramer, a forest health specialist with the Minnesota DNR. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Lane, for having me, and thank you all who are joined virtually. I'm here today to share a little bit of an update on what happened in 2025 in the state of Minnesota. Like Lane mentioned, I'm a forest health specialist with the Minnesota DNR. And before I get into the what we saw, I'm going to talk a little bit about our team and kind of what it is we do and how we assemble all this information. So our team is, I like to think of it as kind of small but mighty. We love the work we do, but there's a lot of ground to cover, and this kind of represents the totality of the Forest Health team. So up in the Arrowhead, you've got Eric Otto. He's based out of Grand Rapids, and then Megan O'Neill is in Bemidji. Rachel Doobie is in Brainerd and also splits her time partly with the State Forest Nursery, so she's very busy there. And then down in this kind of green southern half of the state is where I operate mostly. I'm based out of St. Paul, and then Brian Schwingle, our program coordinator, is also based out of St. Paul. We also work very closely with Gentry Carlson. He's our aerial surveyor, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But while Gentry is not, he's kind of a de facto member of the Forest Health team because we depend on him and his team very much so. So I want to talk a little bit about how we gather up all the data that I'm going to be sharing today. And I named Gentry in the last slide. Aerial survey is a huge part of what we do. You can see in this map, this kind of yellow shaded area represents the aerial survey footprint in 2025. Um, we do, I think, tend to kind of focus on the more of the northern half of the state, and for good reason. That's where a lot of our forested resource is. But usually there are, every other year or so, we'll do some flying down in my neck of the woods as well. In addition to aerial surveys, we also do a lot of site visits and responses to landowners and foresters alike. Um, and so, if people have questions or problems with their uh, forest ownership, they can call us and we can come and take a look and try to offer a diagnosis. Uh, like I said, we are small but mighty and we cover a lot of ground. And so there's a lot of driving and we get a lot of opportunity to do windshield surveys. Basically, observing damage as you're driving from one place to another. So that's just kind of a little bit of a summary of, where we get our data from and how we collect it. Um, and before I get into what we saw in 2025, I'm just going to give you a couple of resources for, how you can access some of this information as well, because an hour presentation or 45-minute presentation, it's a lot, and I don't expect everybody to, remember everything that I say. So first and foremost, we have a DNR website with a lot of our most common and most frequently asked about forest health concerns. Um, it's got, in addition to kind of a who's who of our, forest insect and disease issues, this is also a place where you can go to find all of our publications. So things like our annual reports, our forest health newsletters, um, a document that we call Forest Health Highlights, things like that. So there's also a number of, kind of within these pest specific subheaders, there's a lot of really effective guidance documents. Oak wilt is one that we have a really good uh, guidance document for. So I encourage people to check out the website. Uh, Additionally, every year we put out this great big annual report, which is kind of a summary document, a more I guess comprehensive summary of the information that I'm going to be sharing today. So it's just a big anthology of all of the forest health records that we accumulate throughout the growing season. This is the cover of our 2025 report. This is a really great reference document. It helps you kind of get a sense of what's happened in Minnesota. And we have these all housed on our state website, and they go all the way back, I believe, to, gosh, I want to say 1969, maybe. They go way back. And so it's kind of cool to pick through some of those old reports and you can kind of get a sense for what was happening then versus what we are seeing now. And then lastly, the Minnesota Geospatial Commons is where you can go to get all of the GIS data that is produced through those aerial surveys. So the aerial survey, uh, basically, Gentry and another person go up in the plane, they fly around, and they create polygons of different damage that they are able to discern from the sky, which is incredible. And all of that data is then, reviewed and refined and then posted, and it is available in the Geospatial Commons, and we use it to produce um, all of our maps and guide a lot of our work as well throughout the year. So the GIS component is really, really cool. All right, so that's a little bit of the kind of the infrastructure that we have here. And without further ado, I'm going to get into our 2025 Forest Health Update. And I am going to break it out into kind of, our more local issues, smaller scale issues, kind of interesting things that we saw, and then kind of shift gears a little bit halfway through and talk about some of the larger landscape level issues that we've been continuing to deal with over the years. So the first thing I want to talk about technically is something that happened in 2026. But I think that it's recent and it's kind of interesting, and I think we should talk about it. So starting in mid to late January, it got very cold. And then in around January 23, it got really, really cold. Um, and then it started to warm up a week later. But during that kind of cold snap, there was a lot of talk about exploding trees. And I'm not sure what was different about this year that made people more willing or interested in talking about that. But I was seeing it on social media. I was hearing people talk about it on the radio. One time I overheard somebody in the grocery store talking about it. And so I just think that it's worth bringing up here because we live in Minnesota. We all know that it gets cold here, um, and it's something that is bound to happen again. People will want to talk about this. So generally speaking, there is no risk. I should also throw a quick shout out to the Iowa DNR for this fantastic graphic. This is really spectacular stuff. Um, but it's unfortunately or fortunately, I guess, depending on who you ask, not quite so exciting as all that, because our native trees tissues are well adapted to temperatures that get way lower than your typical winter low in the geographic range in which they grow. For example, paper birch, there's a metric known as freezing resistance, and paper birch is resistant to freezing below 112 degrees below zero. American elm's freezing resistance was kind of the other end of that spectrum, a little on the warmer side, still was between -40 and -58. So this kind of exploding trees phenomenon is more so a myth. But what we do experience is frost cracks, and cold temperatures can cause these vertical cracks to show up in tree trunks, um, and that can kind of create a sound when you're out in the woods. Sound travels farther in colder air, so it's even kind of potentially more likely that you would hear it if you were out on a cold morning. Um, but there's a lot of cool tree science and physiology that goes into why and the way in which these trees crack. Oftentimes, frost cracks are developing due to previous wounds, and they can act as an infection court where in the springtime a disease or decay can enter the tree. That being said, frost cracks typically aren't a primary mode of tree mortality, so it's like I said, it's not quite so exciting as this graphic from Iowa DNR, but it was definitely on our radar at the start of this year, and I expect that we will, if we have another cold winter, we will hear about it again. All right, moving back into some of the warmer times of the year, we had a couple of reports of this interesting insect called hackberry engraver. We had, you know, these small sites with kind of intermediate to mature hackberry, and there was a extensive mortality reported. In some sites, 60% of the hackberry were killed. This is unusual because hackberry engraver is typically a really innocuous insect. Most of the identification resources that I found suggested that this is almost never a tree killer, but is more frequently just infesting branches. Sometimes it can get into a really unthrifty tree that's got a lot of drought stress or root diseases or other issues. Um, we suspect that this is probably kind of a residue from this really intense summer 2023 drought that we had. Um, and like I said, yeah, those two sites, Stearns County and Nicollet County. This is kind of an unusual thing, kind of a cool occurrence. We love to know about these types of things. These, oddball forest pests that usually don't do much, doing more than they usually do. So we like to get these kinds of reports. Another kind of highly local issue that cropped up. This was in the far northwestern part of the state in Elm Lake, WMA. Some late summer defoliation of aspen, and this is a sawfly species. There's a very concentrated defoliation. Um, Late season defoliation usually isn't a problem for the tree because it's going to be shedding its leaves anyway. And this is a stand that we are, going to continue to monitor, and is just another example of something that isn't frequently seen, but these really aggressive sawfly defoliators in aspen up in the Northwest is another thing that we, are interested in tracking. Okay, another one that we spend a lot of time, I think, talking about is bur oak blight. So we had a lot less bur oak blight in 2025 than we did in 2024. Uh, Spring precipitation is really important when it comes to how much bur oak blight we find on the landscape. But even in severe cases of bur oak blight, we don't really there's no that doesn't cause mortality. So this is a pair of maps showing departure from normal precipitation during the month of May. On the left, we've got 2024. If you remember back to 2024, it was ridiculously rainy. And that's evidenced in this map. You can see that almost all of the state is uh, this kind of green or blue, representing above normal precipitation throughout the month of May. Contrast that to 2025, and May looked a lot more normal, a lot closer to the historic norm, um, which is, I think, trees tend to do well with consistent conditions, and so we saw a lot less Baroque blight in 2025. Um, in fact, in 2025, we just had a little bit of a reduction in a lot of the foliar pathogens that depend on spring rain, and that's good for us. So Baroque blight was not much of a problem in 2025. Sticking with oak, there's this phenomenon of oak decline that has been well documented throughout and across the state. It continues to happen. Prior to my arrival at DNR, it was I think in a lot of places, especially kind of like central Minnesota, Little Falls, it was really rough. A lot of decline, a lot of mortality. Um, we saw it starting to slow in 2024 a little bit, and it continued to slow a bit more in 2025. So it seems like it's kind of on its way down. This is kind of it's a complex of different issues. Um, there are a lot of different factors. Inconsistencies in precipitation, which I named, can cause some decline. Shoot blight pathogens. There's a number of insects that can infest branch tips as well that are potentially connected to this phenomenon. But um, while oak decline continues, it does so at a reduced rate, it seems. So this is something that you can see almost anywhere you go. Very common, another thing that you can see almost everywhere you go, a very common insect pest of oaks is two-line chestnut borer. Um, Again, this is so thinking back to a few years before I began with DNR in around 2021, heavy drought. There's an increase in two-line chestnut borer activity, and they tend to seek out kind of already declining or damaged oaks. Um, so this is a native insect. This is actually it's in the same genus as emerald ash borer, which is why it looks so similar. But it is native, and the oak trees here are co-evolved with it. But it seems like it takes advantage of those stress trees. So when we've got drought or too much rain, root diseases, other environmental factors, uh, two-line chestnut borer can affect oak trees that way. And it has kind of a characteristic damage pattern that sometimes we get or that we refer to as kind of dead red and green. So it tends to work its way from the top down. This is in a little bit of an earlier stage. So you can see there's red and then there's still a lot of green leaves on the tree. Next year or the year after this photo was taken, rather, I would expect that what was red would be, just gray, dead branches. Probably down in the middle of the tree, you'd have some more red leaves that are in the process of dying and drying out. And then potentially this tree could still retain some green at the bottom. So it can take a few years for two-line chestnut borer to really work its way through a tree. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one because it's not technically a forest health issue, but it is something that we get some calls about. A lot of folks with lilacs reporting, really uh, thin crowns and late fall blooms. That has been happening for a couple of years, and we got more calls from that in 2025. Uh, there were some of these samples have been submitted to the plant disease clinic. Some came back with no pathogens. Some came back with things like septoria and pseudocercospora, excuse me, which are leaf spot pathogens. Um, so it's something that we are kind of keeping an eye on. It's interesting. We get a lot of calls about it. As it stands, my lilacs in the backyard are still doing great, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed that they stay that way. All right, green striped maple worm. This was another one that was kind of, highly localized, defoliated about 1,500 acres of red maple near Burnside Lake, and this was in July. It's possible that this was a little bit of an underestimate in terms of the acreage affected, um, but it was large enough to be visible from the air, so it was clear that there was, enough of it that it was causing an issue. The initial defoliation was reported by DNR forester doing field work. This is an insect that also feeds on sugar maple and oak. Uh, it's native to North America. It's also known as the rosy maple moth, and you might recognize it if not in its larval form, but in its adult form. It's a super beautiful pink and yellow moth. It's again, it's a native. It's not something that we're anticipating is going to cause a lot of long-lasting or major damage, but something that we saw. Maple petiole borer, sticking with maple. This was a spot in Crow Wing County in June. There's heavy leaf drop um, in maple trees, and for anybody who's familiar with oak wilt, and I'll be touching on oak wilt, of course, in a few minutes, but you see all these leaves on the ground, and you almost think, oh my gosh, is it some sort of wilt disease? But no, this is an insect. Uh, I think all maples are susceptible hosts, but sugar maple is preferred. Several observations were in um, Deerwood area and Crow Wing County. Uh, it's probably not going to be something that is amounts to a landscape scale issue, just kind of a minor thing that affects a few trees here and there. These are sawfly larvae, and the difficult thing with managing this insect is that um, the instinct might be to rake up the leaves and take care of that and potentially reduce the insect number. But unfortunately, the larvae actually stay in the petiole on the twig, so raking up the leaves isn't really going to do anything. Again, this isn't really a serious, threat to the health of the tree, but it is something that can cause very visible damage, and can definitely catch people's attention. All right. I'm going to talk for a minute about Septoroides needle blight. This is primarily in northeastern Minnesota, and it's part of a complex of needle diseases that is, I think, a little bit more concerning in the eastern United States. But here in Minnesota, we first observed Septoroides in 2023, and it's been found every year since then. What you end up with is in white pine, you get these yellowing needles and needle loss. Um, Again, this is a fungal pathogen that is highly influenced by precipitation during the spring months during needle elongation, and it shouldn't really be a major forest health concern uh, unless you have these kind of chronic repeating infections. All right, we had a spot of poplar leaf disease in 2024. It was quite widespread and pretty concerning for a lot of landowners, and some foresters may have seen it. We think possibly that this was due to that increase in precipitation that we had in 2024. It seemed like, there was just every fungal pathogen that we had here was kind of having a field day. But in 2025, the trend did not continue, so I don't have much to report there other than that it seems like it kind of has worked itself out, which is great. Again, highly tied to spring precipitation, and we did not have as much in 2025 as we did in 2024. All right, I believe this is my last of the small occurrences, and then we'll move into some of the bigger landscape scale stuff. I want to talk a little bit about spruce top kill. This is really a common occurrence. Again, it's kind of on the borderline of what is forest health versus what is potentially urban and community forestry, but we see every city that I've been to in Minnesota, it feels like has these planted spruce that have a completely dead top or a top that is on its way towards death. We really don't get a lot of calls about it. It's just something that we internally have noticed. We don't know the cause of it, and we don't really know what the extent of it is. I mentioned earlier that windshield surveys are kind of something that we partake in. It's a way that we can collect some form of data. Um, and this is a good example of that. So, uh, what I've been kind of doing over the last year or so is, as I've been driving to other sites, I've been kind of just dropping a point every time I see one. Um, and it seems like it's very much, and there's a little bit of sampling bias here, of course, but it seems like it's very highly centered around this Twin Cities Metro and the West Metro specifically. Um, I've managed to get my hands on one sample of a spruce top, and I'm interested in getting more if I can. But when I dissected that sample, I found some evidence of a clearwing moth in the genus Cynanthedon. But just given how ubiquitous and how common this issue is, I'm interested in more because I think one sample doesn't necessarily equal a super clear diagnosis, and there are plenty of other things that can cause top kill in spruce. So we're interested in learning more about this spruce top kill issue. Okay, now we'll shift gears a little bit and go into some of the landscape scale issues that we've been managing or at least tracking over the last few years. So this is a photo of a lowland hardwood stand, ash dominated, and you can kind of see maybe in this center of this photo, there's this ash tree that's covered in moss. It's also got evidence of bark flecking or woodpecker activity. Uh, they go in and they seek out emerald ash borer larvae and they peel the bark off to do so. So that's one of the ways that you can kind of identify emerald ash borer in the field. This was in Sand Dunes State Forest, I believe. So since we're looking at EAB, I think we should start with EAB. This is a map of not necessarily the full range of emerald ash borer, just where the quarantine zones are in the state. And the quarantine is administered by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Um, in 2025, we had 6 new counties. Those are shown in yellow here that registered emerald ash borer observations. Um, those being Aitkin, Wadena, Ottertail, Meeker, Murray, and Itasca. Um, so I want to pause for a moment too and earlier when we were talking about really cold temperatures, I think one of the things that sometimes gets really exciting for people thinking about emerald ash borer is, oh, did it get cold enough to kill all of the emerald ash borer? And unfortunately, the answer is usually always no. Um, Cold temperature can kill some emerald ash borer. In laboratory studies, there's documentation of 50% mortality at negative 20 degrees, 90% mortality at negative 30. But there's a lot of moving parts in, how an insect can survive the winter. So, even, the matter of which host tree the insect is in and where that host tree is growing, how much sunlight, what the ambient air temperature, all of those things can affect mortality. So while a really cold snap can potentially kind of knock back a local population a little bit, I don't expect that, the cold winter that we had this year is going to, significantly mitigate emerald ash borer movement or activity, at least not on the greater landscape scale. So just something to think about. This is some kind of interesting analysis on the current state of emerald ash borer infestation, at least on state forest land. So lowland hardwood forests make up about 9% of the Minnesota forest resource. Uh, it is kind of an interesting contrast. Ash, I think, makes up about 30% of our community trees. So there's a little bit of an imbalance there. But um, of the hardwood forest, the lowland hardwood forest resource in Minnesota, the DNR only manages about 17% of that, which is 136,000 acres. So those 136,000 acres are plotted on this map in green. And if we look at where emerald ash borer is currently, you'll notice that a lot of that green area is still untouched. In fact, through 2025, only about 2% of state managed ash stands are found to be infested with EAB. Um, that's bound to change. EAB is still spreading. The rate of discovery is low. Um, the rate of spread for emerald ash borer is about a half mile a year, give or take. So this map is bound to change for sure. But you can see that a lot of the known activity is really centered in the metro and further south, and then in Duluth as well. So um, monitoring and keeping track of emerald ash borer is a huge priority. It's something that we really strive for. And MDA and us, we would like to receive reports of infested ash beyond the known range and beyond the quarantine zone. MDA has a website with a great interactive map that can show quarantine boundaries and areas where emerald ash borer has been identified. And there's a number of ways that you can get in touch with them. There's a report a pest form. They have an email account and there's a phone number as well. And then there's a number of apps. I think I personally use this Great Lakes Early Detection Network app. You can just submit photos and a little bit of information if you happen to find emerald ash borer out in the woods. And then EDD Maps is another good one. Okay, moving on. I'm going to talk about forest tent caterpillar. This is a native insect that feeds on deciduous trees. Usually you get kind of this population peak with forest tent caterpillar every 10 to 15 years or so. The last time that we had kind of tracked a population peak event was in 2013. So we're due for another one. Um, yeah, this general kind of upward trend since 2019 when there was another kind of minor crash of population. But 2024, we counted 79,000 acres or so of defoliation. And then in 2025, we only got 41,000 acres. Um, so the one of the things that we kind of talked about as a team was that, in 2024, remembering that there was all that precipitation and all that extra, um, kind of leaf disease that was occurring, a lot of these aspen leaf diseases could be confused with forest tent caterpillar. And so it's possible that there's maybe some survey error, but we're still keeping an eye on forest tent caterpillar and kind of expecting that it's gonna potentially trend upwards and continue to grow. So you can see in this photo there's a handful of trees kind of in this background a little bit that have really thin crowns, and those are trees that have been defoliated by forest and caterpillar. A lot of the activity of forest health caterpillar in the state was centered in Aiken County. Um, the further you get from Aiken County, the less impact you see. It's really kind of the hot spot there is in Aiken County, and especially kind of that northeastern, north central Aiken County. Eastern larch beetle is a bark beetle, a native bark beetle that has been getting a lot of attention over the last 20 years because it's tremendously important and I think you know affecting the tamarack landscape that we have here in Minnesota in a way that is kind of unprecedented. So we'll talk about that for a little bit in a minute. But in 2025, we counted nearly 300,000 acres of eastern larch beetle damage, and 35% of that was damage, significant damage sustained for the first time. So kind of novel infestation. Um, this is a huge number to tack on to an already very large running total. Over 1 million acres have been infested or killed rather by eastern larch beetle um, since its kind of outbreak began in 2001 or so. Um, so this is yeah the highest recorded mortality season since 2022. But something that has been kind of I think a benefit or a pro, or at least a silver lining maybe, is that we are seeing natural regeneration occurring in these tamarack stands. So that's really good. Um, but you can see, for since 2001, there was a kind of this slowly growing population level. And then, right around 2015, 2016, 2017, it just kind of skyrocketed. Um, and this is very unusual. This is a previously innocuous bark beetle responding to changes we think in climate and growing season. It can be really difficult to manage eastern larch beetle too. Often it's a matter of these really poor quality wet sites uh, that larch likes to grow in, or tamarack, excuse me, likes to grow in. Um, and then you kind of couple that with the low economic value of the tree species, and it's hard to kind of convince people to get in and manage or to go get it. So landscape scale control really isn't feasible at the moment for eastern larch beetle. Um, there's some really interesting work coming out of Dr. Brian Ockama's lab, looking at pheromone signals and potentially repellent pheromones for eastern larch beetle, which is really cool. But for the DNR right now, we are monitoring and we are tracking. It's likely that this is going to continue, but like I said, natural regeneration is occurring, so that's good. Another larch pest that we have here is larch case bearer. Excuse me. It's an insect. It's not a native insect, but it doesn't really typically kill trees outright. Um, it's more of just like a little defoliator that you'll see it all along the roadside um, quite frequently. We mapped 36,700 acres in 2025, which was a little less than we had in 2024, but still is a marked increase from prior years that we've been collecting these data. We again we expect kind of similar to how eastern larch beetle is responding to changes in climate. Large case bearer too might be you know changing in that way too. Okay, oak wilt. So this is a photo showing a symptomatic leaf. You can see it's kind of got this bronze tinge, kind of working from the outside in, and it's been shed. And so oak wilt is it's a non-native fungal pathogen that it spreads typically pretty slowly, but it's an interesting disease because it's an invasive species that we are capable of doing kind of boots on the ground management for that is effective, which is really great. Um, 2025, in Minnesota, we did not have any new records of oak wilt in new counties, so it kind of stayed where it was, which was great. Range did not expand significantly. Um, the biggest thing that I like to talk about with oak wilt is the importance of early detection, and what I always say is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So oak wilt is vectored by a number of what are called sap beetles in the family Nitidulidae. And what they are interested in is the fresh wounds that occur in oak trees. And they'll fly from tree to tree. And as they're doing that, uh, if they come into contact with an oak wilt infected tree, they can then spread that pathogen via the spores into a healthy tree and infect it. So the way that we kind of mitigate that or get around that is just limiting the time frame in which we are pruning, damaging, cutting, or otherwise wounding our oak trees to outside of the range of time that these beetles are active, which here in Minnesota, usually that's the start of April through mid-July is when those beetles fly. So from April 1st through mid-July, we usually tell people, don't prune your oaks, don't cut your oaks, just let them be, because those sap beetles are flying, and you have a much higher chance of infecting a healthy oak tree with oak wilt during that time frame if you're cutting it. So this is a map showing kind of where. Oh, this is a map showing where oak wilt currently is in the state, where it's known in the state. Um, this big black polygon is where it's most commonly found. The gray counties rather are where oak wilt has been confirmed, and then it's a little hard to see on this map. But these blue dots are just spots where oak wilt has been confirmed. And I'm actually going to just skip through these bullet points because these are not super relevant. But I mentioned previously that we have a great website with Minnesota DNR Forest Health. Our oak wilt page is full of information that I refer to regularly, including our Minnesota DNR oak wilt guidebook. Uh, it has all kinds of really great information for land managers and professionals, uh, whoever. If you've got oak wilt, I just think this is a really great resource to have. Um, and so it's also part of the knowing where it is and knowing what it is hugely important too. So if you think you've got oak wilt in a tree that's outside of that commonly found polygon in Minnesota, please let us know, because we can come take a look, we can check it out. Um, we want to make sure that we're keeping oak wilt to the extent that we can. We want to keep oak wilt where it is and not let it spread uh, north to our northern red oak and pin oak resources up there. Okay, shifting gears a little bit to spruce budworm. I know that the name spruce budworm implies that it is a spruce pest, but it really prefers balsam fir. It does defoliate spruce as well. This is a native insect that is quite common, more so up in the Arrowhead in the northeast part of the state. It's a defoliator, so it's feeding on the needles. And while a single year of defoliation probably isn't going to kill the tree, repeated years of defoliation can kill the host um, and is a huge stressor on the tree. So it kind of predisposes it to perhaps other factors, bark beetles or other diseases, issues, things like that. We recorded 182,000 acres in 2025, and we think that this is probably an underestimate as well of the actual impact. You might remember in the summer of this last year, we had a lot of smoke. Um, I think you're looking at some of the climate journals that the State Office of Climatology puts out. I think 2025 was one of the smokiest years in the last 50 or so, which is pretty remarkable. Um, we had issues getting planes in the air to survey this stuff, unfortunately, and so we think that 182,000 acres is probably a little bit on the low side. Um, it's for reference or for comparison's sake, too, in 2024 we had 708,000 acres, so quite a bit more in 2024 than 2025. Um, Typically with this insect, outbreaks are every 6 to 10 years or so, or excuse me, they last for 6 to 10 years in duration, and then they kind of cycle every 30 to 60 years or so. And the feeding activity and the damage caused to these trees um, can kind of promote conditions that potentially increase wildfire potential. And it's so there's kind of this cycle or this self-feeding loop of, if we suppress wildfire in these stands, it can kind of exacerbate the conditions because spruce budworm really likes to feed in multi-age uh, forest systems where they can kind of go from one tree and then drop down to another one and keep feeding. Um, and that in turn kind of increases the potential for wildfire. So it's closely linked there, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, a little bit more in depth. But this is just a map showing the spruce budworm damage mapped in 2025. The color gradient here is indicating severity, so the darker polygons are a little bit more severe than the lighter ones, and you can see that it's kind of all in that northeastern part of the state here. So this is a series of maps that I want to show that's um, sort of interesting and speaks to this kind of progression or spread of spruce budworm throughout the state. Uh, this is going to show, and I realize there's a discrepancy between the title and the legend of this map. So we'll just say, we're starting in the early 90s, early to mid 90s through 2000 is this light green color. And then early 2000s, 2001 to 2013 in the gray. So it's moving east. 2014 to 2019, moving further east still. And then 2021 to 2024, you see it kind of continuing eastward, maybe filling in some of the gaps where it wasn't active in previous decades or previous years. And then if we overlay that with some of our larger wildfires in 2025, you can see that there were a couple of them, the Greenwood fire and the Camp House. Greenwood fire was in 2021, and then the Camp House fire and the Jenkins fire in 2025. All of these burned in forests that were damaged by spruce budworm in previous years. And we think that spruce budworm is probably making these fires ignite faster, burn hotter, and spread at a rate greater than they would otherwise. And this is again kind of an example of, these are the Camp House and Jenkins Creek fires that was in May. They occurred within areas that had old spruce budworm mortality, and these extra fuels likely made the conditions worse. All right, this kind of segues into what I believe is my final subject for this presentation, which is a kind of an abiotic factor. The Bemidji blowdown is what we've been calling it. Let's see, I think this was in late June. Yep, late June of 2025. There was a massive storm in the Bemidji area with straight line winds up to 100 miles an hour. Um, this was a weather event referred to as a derecho. Uh, and we sent out flights the next day and throughout the summer to capture the extent of the damage. This is an aerial photo. You can see um, a lot of wind damage, trees blown down, and on the ground it looks similarly dramatic. Um, it was a pretty big deal throughout a lot of Bemidji. Um, I think the strongest winds prior to this in Minnesota were in 2012, so it represents kind of a big a historic storm, definitely in Minnesota here. Um, this is you can see pine trees that are blown over. I think there was a bit of salvage logging, and then private landowners, community educators, people going out and you know salvaging burning piles, trying to kind of keep things tidy and keep things clean. Because this was very widespread. So this is a map showing kind of the main path of the storm, and these kind of areas that were harder hit in red, and then yellow and orange, maybe slightly less so, but you can see it just really cut through most of this Bemidji area was really hard hit. Uh, let's see. So this is again a map showing some of that severity in directly in the Bemidji area and more photos of the damage on the ground. Um, and yeah, you can see there's been a ton of damage and a ton of effort in that community to kind of uh, build back from that. So those were the bigger landscape scale issues. One kind of, I guess, in my closing moments before I open it up to questions, um, one oddity that I think was somewhat interesting to us, at least here in the metro, was um, this kind of early warm up followed by a temperature crash in mid-March. I think March 14th and March 15th. It got up to I think in some parts of the state it was mid 70s. And then the next day there were blizzards. And so um, there were a couple of odd forest health occurrences that we suspect were probably connected to that event in some way or another. We got a lot of reports of catalpa trees dying in the Twin Cities, um, and that super intense warm up followed by snow um, is kind of interesting, and I think it potentially was of impact. But that's, I think, all I've got for my forest health update. Thank you all for listening, and I will open it up. We've got, I think, a few minutes for questions.
Great. Thanks, August. And yeah, we do have a couple questions here. So way back towards the beginning of your slides,
Mhm.
someone asked, why are there spots missing in the aerial survey data, I believe it was, within St. Louis County? There's kind of that island there.
Yes, so um, we do not fly over uh, tribal nations, I believe. Um, and so I think that those areas are carve outs that we do not fly over. And I think
Okay.
that I'm not uh, as well versed. I'm sure Gentry could probably tell me exactly why, but I believe that's why those are there. And I think that's just a sovereignty thing. We don't we don't fly over there.
Sure. Thanks. And then another question. So the we're kind of skewed heavily towards maybe some downer news related to trees, right? Like what's actually doing well as a tree species? Are there any? It seems kind of depressing statewide regarding the health of our trees.
Yeah, that's a good question. I maintain that, things in Minnesota are pretty great from a forest health perspective. We While we do have to talk about things like oak wilt and emerald ash borer, I think that there are, a lot of I think that any of these trees, oaks continue to be um, a really valuable species, and in many parts of the state are doing just fine. Same with, the prognosis for ash trees in Minnesota isn't great. But I would also, contend that, in that map that I showed of state, the state forest resource of ash, lowland hardwood, overlaid with the emerald ash borer occurrences in the state, I think that like there's still a long way to go with emerald ash borer. There's a lot of people working very hard on emerald ash borer. I think Dr. Blanchett's lab has been doing some really interesting work on biocontrols. Um, and I think that there are efforts within the DNR even to work on, ash preservation projects. Um, so even in the worst cases, or the trees that are at most dire risk, I think that there is still a lot to be excited about, and still a lot to support. Um, That being said, I did just plant a hackberry tree in my front yard. Have noticed a lot of my neighbors doing the same. So I'm a big hackberry fan. I think that they tend to. I've seen fewer issues in hackberry than I have in some other species. But then again, I did have a slide all about hackberry engraver. So everything has a pest, I think, is kind of the takeaway. But everything, most of these tree species that are native to Minnesota um, are still, in many parts of the state are doing just fine.
Yeah, and there's certainly also to highlight kind of on the ash note to Aaron Clark's work and others looking at what follows after these simulated EAB infestations. So the silviculture's keeping up at least on the research front, at least to answer some of these
Absolutely.
questions.
Yeah. And one of the stated missions of the DNR forestry division is in these places where we have lowland hardwoods, we want to keep forested areas forested. So that research lane that you're talking about and the importance of silviculture, I think can't be, that is so massively important. And um, keeping trees on the landscape is really what we want to see. So that's right. Yeah.
And on that note, is it good management to replant some of these various oak species or maybe hedge your bets with some other native species that are appropriate for the location and the conditions?
I'm a big fan of biodiversity and diversity of species. I think that that's something that I often try to support. That being said, replanting oak is totally legit. Um, I think that is absolutely something that you can do. Um, I think that there's a I think you can I've read some studies where you can plant oak in areas that have been that have had oak wilt but were clear cut or whatever managed and you can plant oak in those areas and they'll still do fine because they haven't had an opportunity to root graft. Um, and so planting oak is still I think very much a good idea. Um, I don't know, with emerald ash borer, I think that there's a lot of, challenge. I think I would put a lot more faith in the answer of our, state silviculturist than I would in my own. But I think that, there's still very much good reason to plant oak in Minnesota.
So the dwell time of the fungus and let that threat there maybe isn't maybe that ends after some certain period of the removal or
I believe, yeah. So, and this is something that I mentioned the sap beetles, the nitidulids that can vector this fungus from tree to tree over ground. And I failed to mention another way, a really important way in which oak wilts can spread from tree to tree is through root grafts. So underneath in the soil, uh, trees of the same species will often their roots will grow together. Um, and for better or worse, that's it's a really interesting phenomenon, and it's also unfortunately it's a way that problems in one tree can be transferred to problems in another tree. So uh, oak wilt, oftentimes you'll find it occurring in a like a patch or a pocket on the landscape. And that's because one tree will have become infected by, probably a sap beetle or something like that. And then that fungus will work its way down into the roots of that tree and then spread into the roots of healthy trees through those grafts. And then you get this kind of radiating outward pattern. And um, the oak wilt pathogen, it does need, um, I believe if I'm remembering right from some research by Anna Yang, I think it was that oak wilt can survive in root systems of trees for, I want to say 5 years was that research. And I hope I'm not mischaracterizing that, um, but there is a time period where, there is still risk. Um, but in order for, those oak plantings to really form those root grafts and those connections. that takes a little time for them to establish and get big enough for that to happen. So, and that is also, I'll just say quickly, one of the ways in which I mentioned that oak wilt is one of those diseases that we can manage for. Um, in addition to the prevention being worth a pound of cure, I think the cure or the way that you can manage it when it's on the ground is by effectively severing those root grafts between healthy and unhealthy trees using what's called a vibratory plow. It's a big machine that sticks a blade 5 feet down into the soil and cuts through roots. And so that is a way in which we can manage oak wilt if it is already established. But it's a lot easier to keep it out, I think, than try to dig through the dirt with a big blade.
Sure. And kind of building on that, are there any oak tree species that show some tolerance or resistance to oak wilt? Maybe even some of these Iowa oak trees like post oak, chinkapin, swamp white?
Great question. So yeah, this is another thing that I wish I could spend more time on. But um, so in here, so Minnesota, we have kind of two groups of oak. We have the red oak group and the white oak group. Red oaks, that's our northern red oak, northern pin oak. Um, and then in our white oak group, we have bur oak and white oak. And white oaks can get oak wilt, but it moves a lot slower through their system, and they are actually capable of, to some extent, kind of mitigating or managing how much that disease is able to spread through. That's a matter of tree physiology. So red oaks do not form tyloses in their I guess circulatory system, and it's kind of like a little balloon that inflates in the vessel of the tree, in the vessel element of the tree. So um, this is the it's you can think of it. There's a reason why we use white oak barrels for things like wine and whiskey, and not red oak barrels, and it's because red oak barrels the moisture will just drain right out. White oaks have those tyloses, and it basically just like plugs up the hole. And so if you think about it, if you apply the you know the fungus to that situation, it's like you've got oak wilt that has entered this white oak tree. If it is able to kind of cordon off that that fungal element, it can kind of keep the oak wilt infection in place, or at least prevent it from spreading um, fast that all that fast. And so with red oaks, we see sometimes you get mortality of a mature red oak tree that gets infected with oak wilt can die in um, like 6 weeks or so. And with a white oak can still get oak wilt, but it might take several years for that tree to die. Um, and I think that there are some records or some evidence that suggests that like they might survive that um, occurrence as well. So the red oak group is way more susceptible than the white oak group, but white oaks can still get oak wilt.
Great. Well, thanks so much, August. I think there's maybe a couple questions that we didn't get to. The email, August's email is right there. And if you would like, please reach out. And thanks so much for the presentation today. And thanks to all of y'all online for joining us. Please come back this time next month on April 14th. And Mike Demchek is going to talk about northern hardwoods, kind of continuing our oak conversation and broaden it a little bit beyond the doom and gloom of oak wilt. But yeah, thanks everyone, and see you next month. Take care.